My name is Renata Voss. I was 27 when the life I thought I understood quietly folded in on itself, like a letter someone had already decided not to send. I want to start with something small because that's how these things always begin. Not with a scream, but with a silence you don't notice until much later. It was a Tuesday. I remember because Tuesdays were the days Daniel and I got coffee before work, a small ritual we'd kept for 3 years, ever since the morning we got engaged in that same cafe with a cracked blue tile floor. That Tuesday, he canceled. Said he had a headache. I believed him because I had no reason not to. I brought soup to his apartment that evening and found my sister Ines there, curled on his couch in one of his sweaters, laughing at something on her phone like she belonged in that space, in that light, in that life. I told myself it meant nothing. Ines had always drifted through people's lives like that, borrowing warmth she hadn't earned, certain the world owed her comfort. I was the one who planned things. She was the one who arrived at the end of other people's planning and called it spontaneity. It took 3 more weeks before I let myself see what was already true. A text left open on Daniel's laptop screen while I searched for a shared document. Not cruel words. Worse, tender ones. The kind of tenderness that isn't new that has practiced itself into fluency. I didn't confront him that night. I sat on the edge of his bed and looked at the ring on my hand, the one he'd chosen because I once mentioned, in passing, months earlier, that I liked how Moonstone caught light without demanding attention. He had listened. That was what made it unbearable, that the same man capable of that kind of listening was also capable of this. When I finally asked him, he didn't deny it. He just looked tired, the way people look when they've already rehearsed their exit. It happened slowly, he said, as if slowness were an alibi. I called my mother that night, certain, the way you're certain of gravity, that she would be furious on my behalf. Instead, there was a pause on the line I still remember the exact shape of. Too long. Too careful. Ines has always struggled to find something steady, my mother finally said. Maybe you could try to understand her side of it. I sat with the phone against my ear for a long moment after she'd finished talking, listening to nothing, understanding everything. There is a particular kind of loneliness that comes from being betrayed by 2 people at once and grieved for by neither. In the weeks that followed, I watched my family rearrange itself around a story that made room for Ines's happiness at the cost of my own. My father called it a complicated situation. My mother called it something that happens in families. No one called it what it was. I moved out of the apartment Daniel and I had chosen wallpaper for. I took the Moonstone ring off and placed it in a drawer, not because I wanted to keep it, but because throwing it away felt like a performance I didn't have the energy to give. Ines reached out once, a message that read, "I hope we can still be sisters someday." I stared at it for a long time. There was no apology in it, only a request that I make peace with something she had already decided to keep. I didn't answer. At my parents' house, over a dinner I'd been guilted into attending, my father said, "You'll find someone else, Renata. You always land on your feet." He meant it kindly. That was the strange cruelty of it. No one in my family intended harm. They simply found it easier to ask forgiveness of the person who wouldn't make a scene. I watched Ines across the table, the way she avoided my eyes without seeming to, the way our mother refilled her water glass before she'd finished it, an old habit of care I recognized because it used to be mine too, when I was the one who needed protecting. I didn't cry at that dinner. I want to be honest about that. The version of this story where I dissolve into visible grief in front of them would be easier to tell and untrue. What I felt instead was quieter and stranger, a kind of clarity, cold and clean, like stepping outside after a stuffy room. I understood, finally, that I could keep asking to be seen by people who had already decided not to look, or I could stop asking. I chose to stop. I didn't announce it. I didn't storm out. I simply began, very deliberately, to build a life that did not require their permission to be good. I want to be clear about something because it matters. I never planned revenge. I planned distance, and distance, it turns out, is its own kind of consequence. I threw myself into work. I was a structural engineer, someone who believed, perhaps too literally, that things which are built well don't collapse. I took a transfer to a project 2 cities away, a bridge retrofit that would take 14 months. I told my parents I needed space. I did not tell them how much. The first months were the hardest. I'd wake at 4 a.m. with my chest tight, reaching for a version of my life that no longer existed. I started seeing a therapist, a quiet woman named Dr. Achterberg, who once told me, "Grief for a betrayal is really two griefs stacked on top of each other, the loss of the person and the loss of who you thought they were." I didn't understand that sentence until I'd lived inside it for half a year. Slowly, something shifted. I started running in the mornings, not to escape anything, just to feel my own body, do something reliable. I reconnected with an old college friend, Priya, who never once asked me to explain myself, only to keep showing up, which I did, badly at first, and then less badly. I did not block my family. I simply stopped initiating. Birthdays passed with a single message, nothing more. Holidays I spent elsewhere, citing work, which was not entirely a lie. Somewhere in the 9th month, I noticed I had gone an entire week without thinking about Daniel. Then 2 weeks. The absence of thought was its own kind of arrival. I heard fragments, the way you do, a cousin mentioning that Ines and Daniel had moved in together, that things seemed intense, that my mother had grown quieter at family gatherings, though no one would say why. I didn't ask for details. I found, to my own surprise, that I didn't need them. By the end of that year, the bridge project was finished, ahead of schedule. I stood on it the day it opened, watching cars cross something I had helped make solid, and I understood that I had spent the year doing the same thing to myself, one quiet reinforcement at a time. What I hadn't known, what I wouldn't understand until later, was that while I was rebuilding myself 2 cities away, the thing my family had chosen over me was quietly coming apart. I learned it in pieces, the way truth often arrives after you've stopped waiting for it. Priya heard from a mutual friend that Daniel had grown distant, that Ines had started calling their relationship harder than I expected. Apparently the qualities that made Daniel easy to fall for, his attentiveness, his stillness, had curdled in proximity into something else. He'd grown critical, my cousin said. Ines had grown smaller. I felt nothing triumphant hearing this, which surprised me. Mostly I felt a kind of tired recognition, the way you might feel hearing that a house you once loved had a foundation problem all along, one you'd sensed but never had proof of. My mother called more often that year, always with some pretext, a recipe, a photo, just thinking of you. I answered when I had the space to, and let it go to voicemail when I didn't. I was no longer performing forgiveness I didn't feel, and I was no longer performing anger either. I had simply become someone with less to prove. In one of those calls, my mother's voice cracked in a way I hadn't heard before. "Things have been difficult," she said. I didn't ask what she meant. I let the silence sit there, the same silence she'd once let sit on the phone with me, the night I told her what Daniel and Ines had done. I wasn't punishing her. I want to be honest about that distinction because it matters to how I understand myself now. I simply no longer rushed to fill silences that weren't mine to fill. That winter, I bought a small house on the outskirts of the city where I'd been working. Nothing extravagant, a kitchen with good light, a yard I could see myself growing something in eventually. I painted the second bedroom a pale, hopeful yellow, though I told myself it was just for guests. I was, for the first time in over a year, unhurried. It arrived in March, handwritten, which surprised me. My mother had not written a physical letter to anyone in my memory. I recognized her handwriting on the envelope before I recognized the shakiness in it. I sat with it unopened for 2 days. Not out of spite. I simply wanted to be steady before I let her words into my house. When I finally read it, it was not the apology I might once have hoped for, and not the deflection I'd braced for either. It was something more human than either extreme. My mother, admitting in careful, uncertain sentences that she had chosen comfort over courage, that she had told herself a story about Ines needing more protection and had not asked what that story was costing me, that she missed me in a way she hadn't let herself feel until the house got quiet enough to notice. She mentioned, almost as an afterthought, that Ines and Daniel had separated, not with satisfaction, but with something like grief of her own, grief for the family she'd tried to hold together by asking the wrong person to bend. I didn't respond right away. I sat with a letter on the yellow-walled second bedroom's windowsill for almost a month, reading it occasionally, the way you return to a photograph of somewhere you used to live. What moved me, in the end, wasn't the apology itself. It was one line, near the bottom, where her handwriting grew smaller, as if she were embarrassed by her own honesty. I don't expect you to come back to us. I only wanted you to know that I finally understand what I let happen. I realized, reading it, that I had spent over a year afraid that healing would mean either total reconciliation or total severance, that there was no room between forgiving everything and forgiving nothing. I wrote back 4 sentences. I told her I appreciated her honesty. I told her I was not ready to see them, and did not know when I would be. I told her that whatever came next would happen at my pace, not out of obligation. I told her I hoped she was taking care of herself. I mailed it before I could talk myself into writing more. Ines never wrote a letter. I want to include that honestly because I think it says something true about the difference between the two of us, and about the difference between regret and consequence. She called once in the spring from a number I almost didn't answer. Her voice was thinner than I remembered, stripped of the easy confidence that had always made rooms rearrange themselves around her. I don't know how to start this, she said. I didn't help her. Not out of cruelty. I simply had nothing left to offer in the way of making things easier for her. That had always been my role, the older sister who smoothed the path, and I found I no longer had it in me. She told me, haltingly, that things with Daniel had ended badly, that he'd grown cold in a way she hadn't expected, critical of things she now suspected he'd once found endearing in me and grew tired of when she offered the same. She said this without quite realizing what she was admitting, that she had wanted a version of my life, and gotten, instead, a mirror that no longer flattered her. I think I convinced myself it wasn't really hurting you, she said, because you never showed it. I told her the truth, plainly, without theater, that not showing pain isn't the same as not feeling it, and that mistaking my composure for absence of harm had let her avoid the size of what she'd done.
She cried.
I didn't join her. I felt something closer to sorrow than anger, sorrow for the sister I'd once been close to, who had somewhere along the way decided that taking was easier than earning. I didn't offer forgiveness that day. I told her I needed time. That time was not a punishment, but a fact. She said she understood. I'm not sure she did, not fully, but it no longer felt like my responsibility to make sure she did. I ended the call gently. There was no triumph in it. Just the quiet, unglamorous work of a boundary finally being permitted to exist. A year after that Tuesday with the canceled coffee, I found myself, unexpectedly, at peace on an ordinary evening. The kind of peace that doesn't announce itself, that you only notice retroactively, the way you notice a headache has lifted by realizing you can't remember when it stopped. I had built a life that no longer orbited the family that had once asked me to shrink for their comfort. I had colleagues who respected my work. I had Priya, who'd become something like a chosen sister. I had the yellow room, which I'd finally stopped pretending was for guests and started using as a study, filled with drafting tables and the particular mess of someone building things she cared about. My mother and I spoke more regularly by then, carefully, like two people relearning a language. She never pushed for more than I offered. I think she'd finally understood that the price of my return, if it came, would not be paid in her urgency. My father remained more distant, uncertain how to hold a version of the story where he wasn't simply the reasonable one. I let that distance be what it was. Not every relationship heals on the same timeline or heals at all, and I'd stopped believing that was a personal failure. Ines and I exchanged occasional messages. Nothing warm yet, but nothing performed either. I heard she'd started therapy of her own. I hoped, genuinely, that she meant it. Daniel I heard almost nothing about and found I no longer wanted to. He had become, in my memory, less a wound and more a lesson, that being chosen isn't the same as being valued, and that people who take what isn't offered rarely know how to hold it once it's theirs. I marked the anniversary of that Tuesday alone, on purpose, with a walk along the bridge I'd helped rebuild. I stood at its center, watching the water below, and realized I felt no need to return to who I'd been before any of it happened. That version of me hadn't known yet what she was capable of surviving. They came back to me the way water finds its way back to lower ground, not with drama, but with a kind of inevitability born from what had cracked apart when I left. It was my mother's birthday that brought us all into the same room again, 14 months after the letter. I chose to go. Not because I owed it to anyone, but because I was ready, and readiness, I'd learned, was the only currency that mattered now. Ines was there. Thinner, quieter, older in the eyes than her years. She didn't ask for anything when she saw me. No grand apology, no performance of remorse. She simply said, "Thank you for coming," and let that be enough. My father hugged me for the first time in over a year, and I felt, in the stiffness of it, how much he too had been rebuilding something inside himself, however clumsily. I sat at that table not as the daughter who had been wronged and was owed a debt, but as a woman who had built an entire life without them and had chosen, freely, to let them witness a small part of it. That distinction mattered more than any apology could have. Later, on the porch, my mother sat beside me in the cooling evening air. "You didn't need us to fix this," she said. "You did it yourself." "I needed you to see it," I told her. "Not fix it. Just see it." She nodded, and for the first time in over a year, I let her rest her hand over mine without flinching from what it used to mean. I think often now about that Tuesday, the one where a canceled coffee quietly began the unraveling of a life I thought was settled. I don't feel gratitude for what happened. Betrayal doesn't deserve gratitude, and I won't pretend it does. But I've come to understand that the year I spent building myself back up, alone and unhurried, gave me something no apology ever could, proof that I did not need to be chosen by anyone to become whole. The moonstone ring is still in that drawer. I haven't decided what to do with it. Some mornings I think I'll finally let it go. Other mornings I think I'll keep it, not as a wound, but as a marker, a small, quiet stone that caught the light once and reminded me, when everything else went dark, that I still knew how to build something that could hold weight. Some betrayals don't end in fire. They end in silence, distance, and the slow, deliberate work of choosing yourself. Renata never sought revenge. She simply stopped shrinking and let her own life become the answer no one else could argue with. If this story moved you, you know someone who's been asked to be the understanding one for far too long. Share this with them. Subscribe for more stories about quiet strength, family truths, and the women who rebuild themselves without asking for permission. And tell me in the comments, would you have gone back to that birthday dinner or stayed away?